Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Sunday, September 4th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Arkansas State game is in 6 days, the game against Michigan in 83 days. It's been a while since we've had a new game at the start of that countdown, but the Notre Dame game, which we've been counting down to for a couple hundred days, that is now in the past. Ohio State wins 21-10 over the Fighting Irish. I'm joined by Kevin Noon here at Ohio Stadium. And Kevin, it was 235 days or whatever it was between the Rose Bowl and that. And, based on what we saw on Saturday, I would say most Ohio State fans would say, yeah, worth the wait.
Yeah, we could start a countdown for the 2024 game, but there are a lot of games between now and then. But, yeah, it was a game that had a little bit of everything. A little in terms of offense, because there was a defensive tilt for quite a while before Ohio State was finally able to secure the lead and hold on at that point. But, I would sit there and say that there's a lot of things that Buckeye fans will be excited about. I think there are going to certainly be some things that they're going to sit there and worry about a little bit, but on to the next one.
Yeah, it ends up as a double-digit win over a top-5 opponent, and so that in and of itself, you would think, okay, who wouldn't be happy with that? But I think it was sort of, they won by kind of about the margin that maybe people were expecting, but extremely not in the way that you probably were expecting. I think everyone kind of came into the game thinking, well, Ohio State scoring 1 million points on offense is sort of a given, and it's just a question of, is the defense as good? And they're going to be, certainly they'll be able to throw the ball, but can they run it? And will the defense be as good as you think it is? And then all the stuff, the passing game, you come away from the game with there's reasons why the passing game maybe was not as explosive as you would expect. But the running game, oh boy, the running game was great. And oh boy, the defense was great. And it was after thinking and talking about this team for the last 8.5 months, it was we got exactly the opposite of what we were expecting in a lot of ways.
And you sort of fixate on things and you get the opposite. I think that we can go back to 2006 in the Ohio State-Michigan game. The 1-2 game, it's going to be this big defensive game, and it ends up being 42-39. This game had an over-under of 59.5 points. Ohio State, I think when the game went off, was probably a 17-point favorite. This is going to be a game that we're going to see 40 to something, and lo and behold, we don't. It's 10-7 at half, and it's both teams are struggling to move the ball. Ohio State specifically just was not able to get some things done. The usually sure-footed Noah Ruggles missed a field goal. He only missed one last year all season, including kicking the game winner against Utah. But then you have the defense that comes out, and I know we'll talk more about the defense, and everybody's like, is this like the best defensive coordinator hire or the best coordinator hire? Let's not forget we're not that far removed from the hiring of Jeff Hafley, who turned things around after the end of the Greg Schiano era as DC. But once again, it's a reason why, we can sit there and we can talk about things, and then you have to see the game and kind of be like, okay, well, that's what really happened.
Well, and, on the offensive side of the ball, you expected the offense to be, the passing offense to be great, because it was you've got Jackson Smith-Njigba, the guy who had 347 or whatever it was receiving yards in the last game, finished Saturday night with 4 on 2 catches, and hurt, I think, his hamstring. I don't know if they said it on the broadcast. It seemed like he was grabbing at his hamstring on the sideline at one point during the game, and was out. Came back in for one play. They threw him a little swing pass and then was right back out again. And without Jackson Smith-Njigba, we had one of our viewers on the Buckeye Weekly live feed had a great stat, which was, once Jackson Smith-Njigba went out, all the other wide receivers they played had a combined 21 career catches. And so you were really doing it with guys who are very unproven. Last year, the last time they played in the stadium, they had Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave and Jackson Smith-Njigba, and they basically didn't have any of those guys. So you're really starting from scratch. And, that is an invitation to disaster if you're relying on the passing game and you're not sure if you can run the ball. And then, guess what happens? what do they say? Next man up.
Exactly. And let's not forget, too, that Julian Fleming was a game-time decision. He went through some warm-ups and then, couldn't go. I mean, I don't know if he was just going through warm-ups to do that or, if the decision had already been made. So you lose Jackson Smith and Jigba. I mean, Julian Fleming doesn't have a ton of receptions in his career at this point, but you lose two guys right there. So you have to work your way through the room. And Emeka Egbuka has a pretty decent day. Marvin Harrison Jr. probably struggled a little bit, started off really cold. You see Jaden Ballard have an impact. And then, I know we can't talk about the game without talking about the impact of Xavier Johnson. Somebody who has only been on scholarship. I mean, I guess he's been on scholarship for a year, kept it secret for some reason, but, you have to feel great. I mean, and he was a great post-game interview. I mean, it's just one of those stories that you have to feel great about, especially in the midst of them winning the game. I mean, I don't think people would be as happy-go-lucky about it if they would have come up on the short end of the stick.
Yeah, and I don't know how much they talked about Xavier Johnson on the broadcast. I assume a good amount, but if you're not familiar with his story, he had scholarship opportunities at schools like Iowa State and elsewhere and passed those up to come walk on at Ohio State, and has subsequently he's bounced around from position to position, went wide receiver to corner to running back and back to wide receiver, and then scores the go-ahead touchdown in a top 5 matchup, primetime national TV. I mean, you could have given me, if Ohio State's going to score the go-ahead touchdown in the second half, you could have given me probably 7 or 8 guesses before I got to Xavier Johnson as the guy who was going to do that. But stepped up. That's what they need. You need these guys to step up. Emeka Egbuka had 9 catches for 90 yards, something like that. Marvin Harrison, they had a lot of trouble getting him the ball in the first half. Kind of rounded into form in the second half. He didn't have a huge game, but had an effective game. And you didn't need them to do that much because they were able to run the ball so much better than we've seen them run the ball in the past. And not only run the ball, but run the ball when it was very obvious they were going to be running the ball. It seemed like they just kind of ground down that Notre Dame defense over the course of the night. And then when they needed to be able to run the ball, Miyan Williams, Trevion Henderson did it, kept those chains moving, and won the game.
Exactly, and that was a huge thing because Ohio State got away from the run a lot last year, and they didn't have a lot of crunch time, but you lose a couple games along the way, and you do have crunch time in those games, and they were able to move the chains, but Tom was on the field shooting pictures, so he didn't have the benefit of watching Buckeye Twitter, and people were losing their minds over the fact that they weren't running the ball more. Those people got their wish as the game went on, and it really got into the most critical times. But a lot of credit to what Miyan and what Trevion were both able to do. And I mean, there were points. I mean, Miyan came out of the game for a little bit, and we saw him running up and down the sidelines and trying to go through some things and test some things. And there were some points where we didn't see Trevion going through things either. So it's one of those things of you get the physicality of the first game. There's so much of an effort not to take these guys down to the ground and practice and try to limit events or whatever the terminology that Ryan Day was using. You try to limit that, and then you get into the game, and it's very different. The other team doesn't necessarily care how you doing. They don't care about that. So it was good to survive game 1, and with Arkansas State coming up next here in 6 days.
6 days.
That'll be the next challenge.
Yeah, and I think Ryan Day came away. I mean, I was in the Marcus Freeman press conference. You were in the Ryan Day press conference, but it sounds like Ryan Day was about as happy as he's been, which is a little weird as a quarterback coach in a game where the quarterback, C.J. Stroud had it was a good line, but it was not an incredible line. It was certainly not a, wow, this is a huge Heisman moment kind of line, which is sort of where the bar is for him right now, fair or not. But, it felt like they proved a lot of the things, both on offense and also on defense, that they have really been trying, all the stuff that they have been questioned about and people have asked about, and people have said, you didn't do this last year, you didn't do that last year. They answered those questions pretty authoritatively, it seems like.
And there'll be the people that'll come out and say, well, CJ didn't do what Bryce Young did. Well, Alabama didn't play Notre Dame. And so they came out and they certainly made the statement that they needed to, and I think when we see the polls come out here, Ohio State may slide a spot or so. I think Georgia was very impressive in its game, but and I can't really say that much about Oregon because last year Ohio State stumbled against Oregon. So, I'm going to just get out there before somebody gets in. It's like, well, you just have really short-term memory at that point. But, I think Ohio State answered so many questions with what the defense was all about. We had the chance to talk to Jim Knowles after the game. He seemed to be pretty happy with what went on there too. There was talk about that they rushed for, I'm looking at their rushing numbers, 2.5, but without sack yardage, it was a little bit higher. And Jim Knowles was like, well, how about we just go with the 2.5 at that point? So, I think everybody felt pretty good about what was going on there. But, you don't win a championship in week one, but you certainly can put yourself behind the 8 ball, and Ohio State was able to avoid that.
Yeah, and I'm going to say a phrase that I said, I feel like about a dozen times on the Buckeye Weekly postgame show, which is you don't want to overreact to week one. Positively, negatively, you don't want to overreact to week one because a lot of times the team you see in week one is not the team that you see in week 7, week 8. Now, that being said, I don't think it's time to pronounce the Ohio State defense like officially fixed and great forever. I don't think you're there yet. But with what you saw, it all kind of lined up with what we were sort of told to expect, what we were told that the defense is striving to do. You saw them doing that kind of stuff. You saw the players who you had kind of been hearing about, Mike Hall, Tommy Eichenberg, Lathan Ransom, I mean, like guys at every level of the defense, guys who you'd kind of been hearing like, watch out for this guy, and guys who we've been talking about. Maybe I just feel good about it because we feel smart because we've been talking about some of these guys for a month or two now, and they all showed out on Saturday night. But, it feels like you can't stamp like A+ on it, and that's that's not the final exam. But it feels like the first test or the first quiz, whatever you want to call it, of the semester, it feels like they passed that with flying colors.
Right, exactly. And that was the big thing. I mean, right off the bat, first series, Mike Hall has a couple of big plays, and I'm sitting next to Tony Girdham in the press box, and we're like, wow, all right, that's going on. And then, Lathan Ransom starts doing some things, and Tommy Eichenberg starts doing some things, and it's the names that you're hearing about, and people, of course, are going to be like, well, what does that mean for Josh Proctor or somebody there? And you have to ride the hot hand, and that was a term that Jim Knowles used in the post-game press conference about riding the hot hand, and Lathan Ransom was the hot hand, and next week it might be Josh Proctor, it might be somebody else at that point. But just some of the changes that we saw some early pressures. There was a sack that Tommy Eichenberg had where, it was disguised very well, and he came in and he was untouched. Ohio State was able to get a good amount of pressure on Tyler Buckner, even if maybe the sack numbers weren't there. It certainly seems like they figured a thing or three out, and that's going to be very important for the long-term goals.
Yeah, I'm looking over at the TV over your shoulder, and they just had a stat up that Ohio State outgained Notre Dame 246-72 in the second half. And Ryan Day always has his phrases and his things that you hear him say over and over and over again, and that those are real points of emphasis in the program. And toughness has been one of his things for years. And when the talent is equated, you hear these certain phrases. One of the phrases we heard a lot from him that I don't think we'd heard before was competitive stamina. And competitive stamina was one of his big things this fall because he felt like last year they would kind of be okay, they'd be okay, and then at the end of the game, when the chips were really on the line, they wouldn't kind of finish the drill. 246-72 yardage-wise in the second half. Total yardage not a great stat, but just as a pure metric here, because I don't have yards per play for the second half, because the ESPN bottom line is disappointing me. It feels like, with competitive stamina being a big talking point, we talked about how happy he was. That's probably another reason why he was pretty happy, because if that was a point, a real point of contention for him, looks like he got it on Saturday.
Well, and I think that you get so much more out of a game like this where you get punched in the mouth and you see how you react at that point. It's very easy. If the schedule were jumbled up and they opened against Arkansas State and then maybe had Toledo and maybe didn't even have Notre Dame. There certainly are teams within the Big Ten that do not have anybody of note. I'm looking at you, Michigan, on their non-conference schedule. I think that with a team that is got a lot of veterans on it, that has certainly the highest of expectations, going out there and being tested and showing that you can come out of the woods no worse for wear is very important. You're going to get so much more out of that than a game where C.J. Stroud puts up, Nintendo numbers, and Trevion Henderson does this, that, and the other, and Jackson. I mean, obviously, you don't want to sit there and be like, "Oh, it's a good thing that JSN got dinged up." No, I don't. I'm not saying that, but you're able to sit there and see what happens when you don't have him at that point, because you're just going to be building some depth, and without Julian Fleming as well. I mean, it opened the door for some other guys that hadn't really had a chance to have their turn.
Yeah, and now probably a bunch more guys will get their turn next week against Arkansas State. We didn't see any of the true freshmen, I don't think, play on offense or defense.
I think a couple got some special teams, but I don't really remember anybody. I mean, when people are like, "Oh, you watched the game," either on the sideline as Tom does or in the press box, what happened? I'm like, let me tell you after I watch it on TV, because it's just a lot going on.
Yeah, and there's a lot to watch for all at once, and you're not necessarily thinking, I wonder if any true freshmen are in. But I don't think we saw a true freshman in the game on offense or defense. You're going to next week. So you have a new, this is not necessarily the same kind of challenge you got against Notre Dame, but the challenge of breaking in some new guys and starting that process for them. So that'll be a very different kind of interesting game next weekend for the Buckeyes as we see some new faces down on the field. We will have probably plenty more to talk about as we wrap up our coverage of the Notre Dame game. We will probably have plenty more to talk about with regard to the Notre Dame game as we kind of get a chance to look at it again. We'll have plenty of interviews coming up this week, plenty of shows. We'll have our usual pre- and post-game show next week. If you did not check that out, make sure you do that. We had 2.5 hours or a little more than that of post-game coverage, including the Ohio State press conference and some instant reaction analysis from Mark Givler and Devin Radcliffe. Then the post-game press conference. Then a little more from Devin and Mark and me, and then the Buckeye Weekly post-game instant reaction show. A lot of different insight, little analysis, just a lot more content in general than we have done in previous years, and we're aiming to do that every week. So should be I don't know. It seems like it's probably going to be a kind of a fun season, and it seems like something that people might be interested in. So make sure you are subscribed to our YouTube channel. Just search Buckeye Huddle on YouTube, and make sure you also hit that bell so you get notified when we do all these live shows, so you don't miss them. But yeah, we did 2 hours of live pregame and 2.5 hours live post-game, and now a morning show. And
boy, are my arms tired.
Well, on that, I guess that'll wrap it up. So thank you guys all for joining us. Make sure you check out BuckeyeHuddle.com. We have it's going to be a busy week. It was a very busy recruiting weekend. A lot of recruits. Probably had a pretty good time. It was a pretty entertaining game. It was a great atmosphere, very loud, very energetic. Crowd was into it for the full 60 minutes of the game. And so we'll have Alex and Mark will have follow-ups with all those recruits. That'll be at BuckeyeHuddle.com this week. We now have actual Jim Knowles at Ohio State real-life game footage for our X's and O's guys, Ross and Justin and Devin, to go through. So we'll have plenty of that. And, of course, Tony, Kevin, and I will have plenty of team coverage for you all week as well. So check that all out at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.